This story is a fictional narrative created from speculation, incomplete accounts, and interpretations that were never officially verified. They say the bear never behaved like an animal. That was the first thing people whispered, long before anyone dared suggest anything stranger. It didn't raid food recklessly. It didn't wander aimlessly. It didn't show the nervous unpredictability people expect from something wild. Instead, it waited. It appeared at the edge of the property at the same hours every day. It followed the same paths. It stopped at the same distance from the house, as if respecting a boundary no one had drawn. The family noticed this pattern before they noticed fear. At first, they treated it as coincidence. A curious animal, a temporary presence, something that would eventually move on. But it didn't. It stayed, and it watched. Not in the way predators watch prey. In the way someone watches a place they recognize but aren't sure they're allowed to enter. The strangest detail, according to the versions told later, wasn't the bear's size or strength. It was its patience. It never approached when the children were loud. It retreated when voices rose. It returned when the house went quiet, almost as if it remembered something about silence. Then there was the gesture no one could explain. One evening, when the family sat together outside, the bear lowered itself to the ground, not in threat, not in submission, but in familiarity, as if this was a posture it had once used for comfort. That was when someone said the name. Not loudly, not as a joke, just a name spoken out of habit. And the bear reacted. Some stories of reincarnation speak of destiny, punishment, or cosmic balance. This one doesn't. This story, according to the fragments that exist, is quieter. It doesn't ask whether reincarnation is real. It asks what happens when love refuses to end and finds another body to remain close. The woman at the center of this story had died months earlier. Not suddenly, not violently. Her absence had settled into the house like dust, visible only when the light hit it just right. The family had learned how to move around that absence, how to speak without pausing, how to keep routines intact, how not to expect her voice in familiar moments. They believed the chapter was closed. Then the bear arrived. Borrowed Bodies is about stories like this. Not proof, not belief, but emotional logic. Stories where something returns not to be worshipped, not to be feared, but to stay near the people it once loved. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel. And while you listen, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Distance often shapes how these stories feel, because what unfolds next isn't about a miracle. It's about recognition, and the unsettling possibility that love, once formed, doesn't always accept the limits we assign to it. The woman had always loved the quiet hours. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. She used to wake before the rest of the house, moving softly so she wouldn't disturb anyone. She drank her coffee outside when the air was still, listening to sounds most people missed. Wind through trees, animals shifting unseen. The subtle rhythm of a place before people claimed it for the day. After she died, those hours became empty. The family avoided them without agreeing to. Mornings started later. Nights ended earlier. Silence felt heavier without her to hold it. Then the bear appeared during those same hours. At first, it was just a shape between trees, large, dark, still, the kind of presence that makes you question whether you really saw anything at all. The husband noticed it first. He didn't mention it immediately. He told himself it was stress. Grief distorts perception. That's what people say when they don't want to examine something closely. But the next morning, it was there again. Same place, same distance, same stillness. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It simply existed where the forest met the open space, as if uncertain which side it belonged to. The children noticed it soon after. They weren't afraid the way adults are. They were curious. They asked questions that had no defensive edge. Why does it come back? Is it waiting for something? The husband told them to stay inside. Not urgently, gently, the way you speak when you don't want to admit fear to yourself. Days passed. The bear became part of the landscape. It never approached the house directly. It followed the same path along the edge, stopping at a point where the woman used to sit in the morning. That coincidence lodged itself in the husband's chest like a splinter. He didn't say it out loud. He just watched. The animal's behavior didn't match the warnings people share. It didn't rummage through trash. It didn't act hungry. It didn't display dominance. It behaved as if the space already belonged to it. One afternoon, the husband stepped outside alone. Not to confront the bear, just to test distance. The bear didn't move. It watched him with an attention that felt patient, not alert, not reactive, patient. The husband felt an urge he couldn't explain. He spoke her name, not as a call, as a habit. The bear shifted its weight, just slightly, enough to be noticed. That night, the husband didn't sleep. He replayed the movement again and again, trying to convince himself it meant nothing. Animals respond to sound. Names are just sound. And yet, something about the timing felt wrong. The bear had reacted before the echo faded, as if it already knew the sound belonged to it. The family began to adjust without realizing it. They avoided loud music. They spoke more softly outside. They sat together longer in the evenings. The bear stayed, and with each passing day, the question they refused to ask grew heavier. Not why is the bear here? But why does it feel like it already knows us? They didn't tell anyone at first. Not neighbors. Not relatives. Not friends who might react too quickly or ask the wrong kind of questions. The presence of the bear felt fragile, like something that would disappear the moment it was explained aloud. So they treated it the way people treat strange weather, by adapting quietly. Meals shifted indoors. Doors closed more gently. The children learned new boundaries without being told they were rule. Everyone sensed that noise mattered now. That volume carried consequences. The bear seemed to understand this. It never appeared when the house was chaotic. It arrived when things slowed, when the day exhaled, when the family sat together without speaking much. It was as if the animal recognized the rhythm of grief. One evening, the youngest child left a piece of fruit near the edge of the clearing. Not deliberately, just forgotten in small hands. When the bear approached later, it didn't rush toward it. It circled once, sniffed, then nudged the fruit aside. It didn't eat it. That detail unsettled the husband more than any show of hunger would have. Animals act on need. This didn't look like need. Over the next days, the bear's movements grew more precise. It avoided the path where the children played. It stopped short of the door every time, as if that line had meaning. The husband began to remember things he hadn't thought about in months. How his wife used to stop at that same invisible line when the kids were asleep, careful not to wake them. How she used to sit in the same spot, back straight, hands folded, watching the yard as if memorizing it. He didn't say this out loud, but he started leaving the door open longer in the evenings. Not wide, just enough to blur inside and outside. The bear never crossed the threshold. It lowered itself again one night, curling its body in a way that felt intentional, not protective, not submissive, familiar. The children noticed this too. Why does it sit like that? One asked. The husband searched for a neutral answer. Animals rest differently, he said. The child nodded, unconvinced. Later, when the house was quiet, the husband spoke her name again, not loudly, not expectantly. The bear lifted its head. This time, there was no movement afterward. No approach, no retreat, just acknowledgement. That was the word that lodged in his mind. Not reaction, acknowledgement. From that night on, the family began to treat the bear less like a visitor and more like a presence. They didn't feed it. They didn't touch it. They didn't test it. They respected it. Respect felt safer than curiosity. There are versions that suggest the husband eventually spoke to the bear, not as a test, but as habit. Small phrases he used to say when his wife was nearby. Observations about the weather, about the children growing too fast. The bear listened. Or at least it didn't leave. When the husband laughed softly at something one of the children said, the bear made a low sound, not threatening, not loud, something between breath and vibration. The sound stopped the husband's breath. It was the same sound his wife used to make when laughter caught her by surprise. Not identical, but close enough to reopen something he had sealed. Grief doesn't respond well to coincidence. It accumulates meaning whether you want it to or not. The family began to change their routines more deliberately. They sat outside longer. They spoke more honestly around the quiet. They found themselves addressing absence less, as if something had returned. Not fully, not correctly, but enough to soften the edges. The bear never stayed through the night. It always left before darkness deepened, returning in the early light. As if it were obeying a schedule the family didn't remember agreeing to, the husband wondered, quietly, guiltily, whether the bear was choosing daylight because the children were awake. That thought scared him, because it suggested intention. He resisted naming it. Animals don't make choices like that, he told himself. And yet, this one avoided storms the way his wife had. It disappeared when voices rose in anger. It returned after apologies were spoken, even when those apologies were meant for someone who wasn't there anymore. The family never touched the bear. That boundary remained intact. But the distance between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like agreement. One morning, the bear didn't appear. The absence hit harder than the first sighting had. The husband felt panic rise. Quick, irrational, the kind that attaches itself to hope you didn't know you'd allowed. He waited. Late morning passed. Then, afternoon. The children asked questions he couldn't answer. Then, near evening, the bear returned. Same path, same pace, same stopping point, as if it had never been gone. The relief that washed over the family felt wrong in its intensity. Relief should not come from a wild animal returning, and yet it did. That was when the husband finally admitted the thought he'd been avoiding, not as belief, as fear. If this was not his wife, then why did losing it feel like losing her again? Acceptance doesn't arrive as a decision. It arrives as habit. The family didn't wake up one morning and agree that the bear belonged there. They simply stopped questioning its presence in ways that required answers. The question shifted from why is this happening to how do we live with it? That shift frightened the husband more than the bear ever had. Because questions can be set aside. Habits settle in. He began noticing how naturally their days bent around the animal's routine. Meals timed a little earlier, walks shortened at dusk. The children learned which parts of the yard were theirs and which were not. Not by instruction, but by watching how the adults paused. No one said, "That's for the bear." They just didn't go there anymore. The bear, for its part, adjusted as well. It never appeared closer than before. It never tested boundaries. It remained exactly where it had always been, as if the agreement was mutual. That mutuality made everything harder. If the bear had advanced, the husband could have called it danger. If it had retreated, he could have called it coincidence, but it did neither. It stayed. The children spoke about it openly now, but not excitedly. Their tone was calm, almost reverent. They gave it a nickname once, then stopped using it, as if names made the situation too real. The husband noticed something else, too. The bear never appeared when he was alone. It came when the family was together. That detail felt deliberate in a way he struggled to explain without crossing into thoughts he didn't want to have. One evening, as the light softened and the air cooled, the oldest child asked a question that had been forming quietly for days. "Is it okay that it's here?" The husband opened his mouth and found no rehearsed answer waiting. "Okay for who?" he asked instead. The child thought for a moment. "For her." The word landed heavily. No one corrected it. No one asked who her meant. Silence accepted the pronoun as if it had been there all along. That night, the husband lay awake longer than usual, listening to the house breathe. He wondered whether allowing the bear's presence was a kindness or a refusal to grieve properly. Grief, he'd been told, required letting go. But what if letting go wasn't the same as pushing away? The bear hadn't replaced his wife. It hadn't spoken. It hadn't touched. It hadn't crossed the final boundary. It had simply stayed close. He began to fear that by allowing this closeness, he was asking the wrong thing of her. If it was her at all, that he was encouraging her to remain trapped in a form that could never truly belong inside the life they once shared. Love, he realized, can be selfish when it fears loss. The next morning, he spoke aloud. Not to the bear, but to the quiet. "If you are here, he said softly. You don't have to stay. The bear did not react. It didn't lift its head. It didn't shift its weight. It remained still, as it always had. That lack of response felt like an answer anyway. Days passed without incident. No escalation, no retreat. The family settled deeper into the arrangement without naming it. The husband noticed how the children's grief changed shape. They spoke about their mother less in the past tense. Not as if she were present, but as if something about her still lingered nearby. He didn't know whether that was healing or avoidance. Sometimes the bear would arrive later than usual, and the waiting would stretch thin. Those were the moments when the husband felt panic spike, not fear of harm, but fear of absence. He hated himself for that. No one should depend emotionally on a wild animal, and yet the relief when it returned felt too real to deny. The husband wondered whether the bear's presence was anchoring them to the past, or helping them stand without it collapsing beneath them. That ambiguity pressed harder each day. One afternoon, a neighbor's voice carried through the trees. Unaware, uninvited, the bear retreated immediately, slipping back into the forest without sound. The family froze. The children looked at their father with something like alarm. It'll come back, he said quickly, without knowing whether it was true. The neighbor never saw the bear, never asked questions, never disturbed the routine. That evening, the bear returned. The relief felt dangerous, because it confirmed something the husband had been avoiding. The bear wasn't just present, it was choosing them. And choice, if this was reincarnation at all, meant intention. The husband felt the weight of a new question settle in his chest. If this was truly his wife, if she had found a way back not to speak, not to touch, but to watch, was it right to accept that gift? Or was the most loving act to encourage her to leave again? The bear lay down at the edge of the clearing, patient and familiar, waiting, not for permission, for recognition. The longer the bear remained, the more the family's grief began to reorganize itself. It didn't disappear. It redistributed. Mornings felt lighter, not because the loss hurt less, but because something had returned to the rhythm of the house. The children laughed more easily. The husband noticed himself speaking to the quiet, less like an empty space, and more like an audience that might be listening. That realization frightened him. Grief is supposed to thin over time, not adapt. He began to wonder whether they were healing or postponing something essential. The bear's presence changed how memories surfaced. Instead of sharp recollections that collapsed into absence, memories arrived gently, almost practically. The children talked about their mother while watching the clearing, as if the two belonged to the same mental space. She liked mornings like this, one of them said once. The bear lifted its head, not abruptly, not fully, just enough to notice. No one commented on it. They were past commenting now. The husband felt torn between gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for the calm that had returned to the household. Guilt for how quickly he'd grown accustomed to it. He worried about what the bear might be sacrificing by staying. If this was his wife, if some part of her consciousness had settled into this borrowed body, what did staying cost her? Was she choosing this form freely, or was she tethered by their inability to let go? He began to speak to the bear differently. Less conversational, more careful. He stopped sharing his worries aloud, stopped narrating daily details. He didn't want to anchor her further if this presence depended on familiarity. The bear noticed the change. It arrived later, stayed shorter. The children felt it immediately. Did we do something wrong? One asked. No, the husband said quickly. No one did anything wrong, but he wasn't sure. One evening, after the bear had already retreated, the husband sat alone outside. The clearing felt larger without it. Emptier. He realized then how much of his comfort had come from believing that love could return unchanged, just quieter, furred, patient. That belief was seductive, but it wasn't fair. If love had truly returned, then it deserved release as much as it deserved recognition. The next morning, the bear appeared again. Same place, same posture. The husband stood at the edge of the yard and felt his chest tighten. He didn't speak her name this time. He spoke the truth instead. If you're staying because of us, he said softly, you don't have to. The bear remained still. He waited. Nothing changed. The husband felt a wave of conflicting emotion. Relief, disappointment, confusion, all colliding at once. He hadn't expected an answer, but he had hoped for clarity. He tried again, not louder, but steadier. "We'll be okay." That sentence surprised him. Not because it felt untrue, but because he realized he meant it. The bear shifted. Not away. Not closer. It rose to its full height for the first time since arriving. The children, watching from inside, gasped quietly. The bear stood there, massive and unmistakably wild, framed by the trees that had always marked the boundary between their lives and whatever existed beyond them. For a moment, the husband saw it clearly, not as his wife, not as a symbol, as an animal, a powerful one, a body that did not belong in a family's grief. The bear turned its head, not toward the house, but toward the forest. Then it paused, just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to feel like a goodbye that didn't need words. It moved away slowly, deliberately, following the path it had always taken. The husband didn't call after it. The children didn't run outside. They watched. The bear disappeared into the trees and did not return that day. Or the next. The absence hurt, but differently now. It hurt cleanly. The husband felt the familiar ache of loss, but without the sharp edge of fear. He realized he was grieving again, but this time he wasn't resisting it. Days passed. The children asked fewer questions. When they did, they didn't sound afraid. "She went back," one said simply. The husband nodded. "Yes," he said. "I think she did." The clearing returned to being just a clearing. Morning sounds returned to being just sounds. Life resumed its unpredictable rhythm, and yet something had changed. The grief no longer felt unfinished. It felt acknowledged. Sometimes the husband still woke early and sat outside with his coffee. The forest looked the same, but the silence felt different. Not expectant, not waiting, complete. He never told anyone about the bear. There was nothing to explain. What mattered wasn't whether it had truly been her. What mattered was that something had come back long enough to be recognized, and then allowed to go. That, he realized, was love without possession. And possession, no matter how gentle, was never what she would have wanted. Absence didn't erase what had happened. It reorganized it. After the bear stopped returning, the family discovered that grief had shifted into a quieter shape. Less urgent, more deliberate. It no longer pressed against them from every corner of the day. It arrived in moments instead. Manageable ones. Mornings were still early, but no longer heavy. The husband continued his habit of sitting outside with his coffee, listening to the forest without expecting it to answer back. The silence no longer felt like something that needed to be held. It simply existed. The children adjusted differently. They didn't speak of the bear often, but when they did, it wasn't with longing. It was with certainty, as if something important had already been completed. "She stayed until we were okay," one of them said once without prompting. The husband didn't correct the sentence. He didn't ask how they knew. Children, he'd learned, don't reason their way into emotional truth. They arrive there directly. The forest itself seemed unchanged. No signs of disturbance. No tracks that could be pointed to. No proof that anything unusual had ever crossed the clearing. That lack of evidence mattered, because it meant the story could remain what it was. Private, intact, uninterrogated. The husband noticed that his memories of his wife no longer came with the same ache. They surfaced gently, often triggered by small habits rather than major milestones. The way the light fell across the yard, the timing of certain sounds, the calm that settled after difficult conversations. He began to realize that what had returned in the bear's presence wasn't her personality. It was her function. She had always been the one who steadied the household, the one who absorbed noise and redistributed calm, the one who knew when to stay silent and when to remain close without intruding. That role had been fulfilled again, briefly, impossibly, through another body. And then it had ended. Purpose completed does not linger. The family's routines resumed without feeling like betrayals. Laughter didn't feel disloyal. Joy didn't feel like abandonment. The absence of the bear had made space rather than reopened wounds. That was the difference. The husband reflected often on the choice he'd made, to speak the words that let the presence go. He wondered whether the bear would have stayed longer if he hadn't, whether the comfort could have been extended indefinitely. But comfort without end would have become dependence, and dependence would have changed the nature of what had returned. Whatever that presence had been, it had not come to replace life. It had come to stabilize it. That understanding settled into him slowly, like a truth that doesn't demand agreement, only recognition. Occasionally, the husband caught himself looking toward the edge of the trees at the same hour the bear used to appear, not with hope, with acknowledgement, as if saying silently, "I see that you were here." And that was enough. There are versions of this story that suggest the bear was seen once more, farther away, indistinct, moving through deeper forest without pausing. Others say it was never seen again at all. The family never tried to confirm either version. They didn't need to, because the return had never been about proof. It had been about timing, about arriving when the family could not yet stand on its own, and leaving when it could. The husband found himself speaking differently about death afterward. Not philosophically, but practically. He no longer described it as disappearance. He spoke of it as relocation of influence. People leave, but what they do for us does not always leave with them. Sometimes it finishes later. Sometimes it finishes differently. The children grew as children do. Their grief did not define them. It informed them. They became more attentive to quiet, more respectful of boundaries they could not see. The husband noticed this with a kind of gratitude that felt earned rather than accidental. One evening, months later, as they sat together outside, the forest went still in a familiar way. Not expectant, not alert, complete. The husband felt the old instinct rise, the urge to speak her name. He didn't. He didn't need to. He realized then that the mission, whatever form it had taken, was never about staying. It was about returning long enough to teach them how to continue without fear. And fear now was gone. What remained was something quieter, confidence. The confidence that love does not always end when bodies do. The confidence that presence can take unfamiliar forms without demanding belief. The confidence that letting go can be an act of respect rather than loss. The bear had lived with them without entering the house. It had belonged without possession. And when it left them intact. That, the husband understood, was the only outcome that mattered. What surprised the family most was not how much they remembered, but how differently those memories behaved. They no longer arrived as interruptions. They arrived as guidance. When conflict surfaced, it dissolved faster. When tension crept into the house, it didn't linger. The family noticed they were better at pausing, better at listening, better at letting moments settle instead of escalating. It felt learned, not taught through words, but through proximity. The husband realized that whatever the bear had represented, it had modeled something essential. It had shown them how to occupy space without consuming it, how to remain present without demanding attention, how to protect without controlling. Those lessons stayed. He noticed them most clearly in himself. In the past, he had filled silence reflexively, afraid of what it might expose. Now, he allowed quiet to exist without explanation. He trusted it. That trust changed how others responded to him. The children sensed it too. They became less reactive, more observant. When upset, they withdrew briefly instead of exploding. They returned calmer, as if they understood intuitively that stillness was something you could enter and leave safely. No one taught them this. It had simply happened. The husband sometimes wondered whether the bear had been there for them, or for him. Whether his wife, if that interpretation held any truth at all, had returned not to be seen, but to reset something she had once carried alone. She had always been the buffer. Now, the family had learned to buffer each other. That realization carried both comfort and humility. If the bear had been her, then she had returned long enough to finish a task, not to stay. And that meant her leaving was not abandonment. It was completion. The husband found peace in that framing, not because it proved anything, but because it aligned with who she had been in life. She never clung. She never lingered past usefulness. She believed love was something that made others capable, not dependent. This presence, whatever its nature, had done exactly that. Occasionally, the children asked questions that brushed against the edge of belief. Do you think she knew we were okay? Do you think she meant to leave when she did? The husband answered carefully. I think she stayed as long as she needed to. That felt true. They didn't speak of reincarnation. They didn't debate meaning. They didn't try to name the experience beyond what it gave them. Names felt unnecessary. Meaning had already done its work. Over time, the forest reclaimed its role as background rather than participant. The clearing lost its significance as a boundary. It became just a place again. And yet, the family treated it with a new kind of respect. Not fear, not reverence, but awareness. They understood now that spaces can hold things briefly, without keeping them forever. That understanding softened the way they approached life itself. Loss no longer felt like a permanent collapse. It felt like a transformation whose final shape might arrive later, in ways that could not be anticipated or controlled. The husband noticed this shift most sharply when someone else in his life experienced grief. He found himself less inclined to reassure, less eager to explain away pain. Instead, he stayed present without rushing resolution. Presence, he'd learned, was sometimes enough. The bear had never solved anything directly. It had simply remained. And in remaining, it had given the family permission to remain too, within their grief, without being consumed by it. This distinction mattered. The experience did not turn them toward belief. It turned them toward patience. Months later, during a quiet evening, the youngest child asked a question that surprised them all. Do you think she was lonely? The husband considered this for a long time before answering. No, he said finally. I think she came back because she wasn't. The child seemed satisfied with that. Loneliness implies lack. What the bear had carried did not feel like lack. It felt like surplus. Something that needed to be placed somewhere before it could dissolve naturally. And once placed, it no longer needed to remain. The husband sometimes imagined that if the bear had stayed longer, something essential would have been lost, not gained, that the beauty of the return had depended on its restraint. Love that overstays becomes possession. Love that leaves at the right moment becomes protection. That understanding reshaped how he thought about endings. Not as failures, but as conclusions that arrive when their work is done. The family did not wait for the bear to return. They didn't hope for it. Hope would have misunderstood the gift. Instead, they carried forward what it had left behind. Calm, boundary, confidence, and something harder to name. A sense that love, once formed, does not need a body to complete its final chapter. It only needs time and permission to leave. What remained after the bear's departure was not emptiness. It was responsibility. The family slowly realized that something had been handed to them, quietly, without ceremony. A kind of emotional inheritance that did not come with instructions, only expectation. Not expectation of belief, expectation of care. The husband began to feel it most strongly during moments of strain, when the children argued, when exhaustion shortened his patience, when life pressed forward with its ordinary demands, indifferent to what they had lived through. In those moments, he felt a familiar pressure, an invitation to slow down. It did not feel external. It felt learned. He understood then that the presence had not simply comforted them. It had recalibrated them. Their emotional reflexes had shifted, bending toward restraint instead of reaction. That shift carried weight, because once learned, it could not be unlearned. The children experienced it differently. They didn't name it as responsibility. They felt it as awareness. They noticed when emotions escalated too quickly. They sensed when silence was needed instead of words. They had learned to read atmosphere. This made them quieter in ways that were not withdrawn, but intentional. The husband worried briefly whether this had cost them something, whether growing up with such awareness would make them older than their years, whether the calm they carried was protection or burden. But watching them, he realized it wasn't heaviness. It was steadiness. They were not afraid of intensity. They simply knew when to pause it. The forest remained unchanged, but the family's relationship to it had shifted. They no longer treated it as background scenery. They listened to it. Not mystically, practically. They understood now that environments respond to behavior, not emotionally, but rhythmically. Noise invites noise. Calm invites space. This lesson carried into their lives elsewhere. At school, at work, in conversations that once would have escalated. The husband noticed that people responded differently to him now. Conflicts softened faster. Silence no longer felt like judgment. It felt like room. He didn't attribute this to the bear. He attributed it to what the bear had practiced around them. Stillness, he realized, is contagious, but only when it is offered freely. He reflected often on the moment he had spoken the words that let the presence go. At the time, it felt like a gamble, an act of faith without clarity. Now it felt like the completion of an exchange. She, if it was she, had given them stability when they could not generate it themselves. In return, he had given her release. That balance mattered. Without release, gifts become debts. The family never spoke about the experience as something that should be repeated. They didn't look for signs elsewhere. They didn't search the forest for confirmation. They understood instinctively that what had happened was specific to that moment. Borrowed, temporary, finished. And yet, the effect remained durable. The husband realized something else over time. The bear had never asked for anything. No feeding, no shelter, no acknowledgement beyond presence. Its gift had been asymmetrical. That asymmetry was what made it safe. Nothing was owed. This understanding changed how the family approached kindness afterward. They became more attentive to moments where help could be offered without expectation, where support could be given without binding someone to it. They had learned the difference between care and attachment. The children, in their own way, practiced this naturally. They comforted friends without trying to fix them. They stayed present without demanding resolution. The husband watched this with quiet awe. Whatever had returned to them, whatever shape it had not come to be remembered. It had come to be integrated. That distinction mattered more than truth, because truth seeks confirmation. Integration changes behavior. The bear had not needed to stay for the lesson to last. It had stayed just long enough to be absorbed. Sometimes, late at night, the husband allowed himself to imagine the presence not as his wife, but as something that carried her intention, a continuation of care rather than consciousness. That framing freed him from questions that had no answers. He didn't need to know how it happened. He only needed to know why it ended when it did. And that answer felt increasingly clear. It ended because they no longer needed it. Love had done its work. The husband found peace in that conclusion, not because it closed the mystery, but because it respected it. Some things arrive only to teach. And teaching is complete when the student can stand without the teacher. The family stood now, quietly, steadily, without fear of collapse. They carried forward not a story of reincarnation, but a practice of presence. And presence, once learned, does not require belief to remain active. Honoring something that no longer exists is harder than holding on to it. The family learned this slowly. In the weeks after the bear's departure, there were moments when recreating the experience felt tempting, sitting outside at the same hour, watching the tree line a little longer than necessary, listening for sounds that once carried meaning. These behaviors weren't hopeful. They were reflexive. Habits linger even after their purpose has ended. The husband recognized this and made a quiet decision. Not spoken, not announced. He stopped waiting. He still went outside in the mornings, but he no longer positioned himself toward the clearing. He faced the open space instead, letting the forest remain what it was again. A place, not a threshold. This shift mattered more than he expected. The children followed his lead without discussion. They stopped asking whether the bear might return, not because they had forgotten, but because they understood something intuitively. Returning would change the meaning of what had happened. If the presence came back, it would no longer be a gift. It would become a cycle. And cycles, once established, trap both sides inside expectation. The family chose, without saying so, not to ask for more. They didn't mark anniversaries of the arrival or the departure. They didn't turn the experience into ritual. They let it remain unframed. Unframed things retain their shape. The husband noticed that when he spoke of his wife now, his voice no longer caught in the same way. He could tell stories without bracing himself for collapse. He could laugh without apology. That didn't mean the loss had diminished. It meant it had settled, and settlement, he realized, was the true outcome of what had happened. Not closure, not proof, settlement. The children processed it in their own language. They drew less about the bear over time. When they did, it appeared smaller in their drawings. Not diminished, but placed farther away. Perspective had returned. One evening, during a quiet conversation, one of the children asked a question that felt like the story's final test. "Do you think she knows we remember her?" The husband thought carefully before answering. "Yes," he said, "but I don't think she needs us to." The child nodded, absorbing this without resistance. Memory, they had learned, was not something you owed to the past. It was something you carried forward responsibly. The forest itself offered no confirmation, no sign, no repetition of the stillness that once marked the bear's presence. Life continued with its usual indifference, and that, too, felt right. If the return had been real in any sense, it had never intended to interrupt the world permanently. It had entered briefly, adjusted something internal, and withdrawn, like a hand steadying a structure before stepping away. The husband began to notice that when others spoke of loss around him, he no longer rushed to reassure. He listened. He allowed silence to do its work. He trusted that grief, given space, reorganizes itself. This trust was the most enduring thing the bear had left behind. Not belief, competence. The competence to sit with uncertainty without demanding answers. He never told anyone the full story. There was no version that would sound reasonable. Any explanation would either invite skepticism or turn the experience into something performative. Neither felt respectful. Some things lose their integrity when translated. The family agreed silently to keep it theirs. Not as a secret, but as something that didn't need witnesses to remain true. Years later, when the children were older, the husband imagined they might revisit the memory differently, question it, reinterpret it, decide it had been symbolic rather than literal. That possibility didn't threaten him, because the value of the experience did not depend on its explanation. It depended on its effect, and its effect was stable. They had learned how to let something come and go without clinging. They had learned how to receive comfort without demanding permanence. They had learned that love can return briefly, not to stay, but to realign what was broken by loss. That lesson required no repetition. In honoring the gift, the family refused to chase it. They let the forest remain silent. They let the clearing become ordinary again. They let the absence stay absent. And in doing so, they preserved what had been given, without trapping it in expectation. The husband understood now that some presences return only once, because their purpose is singular. They arrive when something is fragile, and they leave when it can stand on its own. Anything more would not be kindness. It would be interference. The bear had not interfered with their grief. It had guided it. And guidance, once internalized, no longer needs a guide. As the seasons turned and life layered itself forward, the story receded naturally. Not erased. Integrated. The family did not wait for another sign. They did not look for borrowed bodies elsewhere. They trusted that if love ever needed to return again, it would know when. And it would know how to leave. That trust was the final gift. And it was enough. Life did not resume all at once. It layered itself back in. At first, the changes were so small they barely registered. A morning where the husband lingered over coffee without scanning the tree line. An afternoon where the children played louder, unself-conscious, reclaiming space that had once felt shared with something unseen. Normality didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as permission. The husband noticed this most clearly when he caught himself planning ahead again. Small plans at first. A weekend visit. A change in routine. Things he had avoided unconsciously, as if the presence of the bear had frozen time into a careful pause. Now, time moved. And it didn't feel like betrayal. He realized that during the bear's stay, the family had been living in a kind of suspension. Not unhappy, not unsafe, but delicately balanced. That balance had been necessary then. But balance is not meant to last forever. Growth requires tilt. The children adjusted faster than he did. They returned to habits that had nothing to do with memory or meaning. They fought. They laughed too loudly. They forgot things. For the husband, this forgetting was the hardest part. Not because it erased his wife, but because it confirmed something he had been avoiding. Life does not wait for us to be ready. It continues when we allow it to. One evening, months after the bear's departure, the family hosted their first gathering since the loss. It was small, casual, imperfect. Laughter stumbled in unexpected places. Silence appeared briefly, then passed. The husband watched the room carefully, half expecting the old ache to rise. It didn't. Instead, he felt something steadier. Confidence. Not in himself, in the structure of things. The house held the noise without strain. The children moved easily through the space. The absence no longer dictated behavior. That night, after everyone had left, the husband stood outside alone. The forest was dark, unremarkable, uninterested. For the first time, that indifference felt comforting. He understood then that the bear had not been a replacement for his wife. It had been a bridge, a temporary form that allowed something unfinished to cross from loss into continuity. Once crossed, the bridge was no longer needed. The husband thought about how often people ask for signs after death. Proof, assurance, something concrete enough to hold on to. But what they rarely ask for is instruction. What to do next? How to continue? How to live without turning grief into a shrine? The bear had answered those questions without speaking. It had shown them how to stay close without clinging, how to protect without interfering, how to leave without abandonment. Those lessons did not fade. They embedded. The children grew into them quietly. They became attentive without being anxious, empathetic without losing themselves. The husband recognized in them traces of the woman he had loved. Not her personality, but her steadiness. That steadiness mattered more. Sometimes the husband wondered whether the story would sound absurd if spoken aloud. A woman returning as a bear, living at the edge of her family's life, leaving when asked. It didn't matter. Truth, he had learned, is not always factual. Sometimes it is functional. And function is measured by outcome. The outcome was this. The family survived without hardening. They healed without denial. They moved forward without erasing what had been lost. The bear did not become a legend. It became a chapter, one that ended exactly when it should have. On certain mornings, the husband still felt the impulse to look toward the forest, not for the bear, but for what it represented. He no longer expected anything to appear. He simply acknowledged that something had once stood there long enough to matter. And then he went back inside. Life now required his presence elsewhere. As time passed, the story lost its edges. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to defend its meaning. The family stopped referring to time as before and after. Days regained their natural sequence. Birthdays came and went without hesitation. Ordinary problems reclaimed their rightful weight, no longer overshadowed by absence or wonder. The husband noticed this shift one afternoon while fixing something trivial in the house. A loose hinge. A door that didn't quite close right. He caught himself humming without realizing it. The sound startled him. It wasn't guilt that followed. It was gratitude. Gratitude that his body had remembered how to exist without constant vigilance. Gratitude that the quiet no longer carried expectation. Gratitude that love had not demanded permanence to remain meaningful. He realized then that the bear had never been meant to stay long enough, to become ordinary. Ordinariness would have undone the gift. What had returned had done so briefly, intentionally, so that its impact would remain clear. The family would always know where the change had come from, without needing to relive it. The children grew older with a subtle confidence that surprised teachers and friends alike. They were observant without being guarded, calm without being withdrawn. When asked where this steadiness came from, they didn't have an answer. They didn't need one. Not everything that shapes us can be named. Sometimes shaping happens through proximity alone. The husband noticed that his memories of his wife no longer arrived as loss. They arrived as reference. He would think, she would have liked this, or she would have known what to say here, without the familiar tightening in his chest. The bear had not brought her back. It had returned her influence. That distinction made all the difference. Influence does not trap. It guides, then releases. On one quiet evening, long after the forest had returned fully to anonymity, the family sat together outside again. No ritual, no expectation. Just air, fading light, and shared presence. The husband felt something settle gently in him. Not memory, not longing, completion. He understood then that the story was finished, not because something dramatic had ended, but because nothing needed to continue. The bear had come to live with them only long enough to remind them how to live without her. That paradox no longer felt confusing. It felt precise. If reincarnation existed in any meaningful way, he realized, it did not have to announce itself with miracles or spectacle. It could arrive quietly, take on a form capable of patience, and leave once its work was done. No proof required. No belief demanded. Just outcome. The outcome was this: a family that could move forward without fear of forgetting, children who could grow without carrying unresolved grief, a husband who could love again, not instead of, but alongside memory. The forest never offered another sign, and that too felt intentional. Signs are for beginning. Endings ask for trust. The husband trusted that if love ever needed to return again, if someone he loved needed help crossing another fragile moment, it would find a way that fit the need, not the desire, and it would leave when staying no longer served anyone. That trust reshaped how he viewed loss itself, not as an abrupt severing, but as a redistribution of presence across time. Some presences stay in bodies. Some stay in behavior. Some return briefly to finish what could not be finished before. And then they go. The bear had lived with them without belonging to them. And in doing so, it had taught them how to belong to their own lives again. That lesson endured. This story doesn't ask you to believe in reincarnation. It asks you to notice what changes when love is allowed to return without being claimed. The woman in this story, if she returned at all, did not come back to be recognized, named, or proven. She came back to steady something that had lost its balance. And when that balance was restored, she left. Not because she was forced to, because her purpose was complete. Borrowed Bodies tells stories like this not to explain what happens after death, but to explore what remains unfinished in the living. Sometimes what returns is not a soul, but a function. Not a person, but the role they once played. And when that role is fulfilled again, even briefly, the living are free to continue. There was no miracle here, only timing, only restraint, only love that knew when to stay close and when to step away.